Being forced into a marriage with someone you despise, someone who's been your sworn enemy for years, that's exactly what happened to Elena Caldwell and Daniel Hayes. Their union was built on hatred, revenge, and a desperate fight to save their families' legacies. But what started as a cold, calculated arrangement soon turned into something neither of them expected. As secrets unraveled and danger closed in, their hearts began to change in ways they couldn't control. Could love truly bloom from the ashes of betrayal? Stay with us as we dive into this gripping story of passion, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. The storm raged over Chicago, its howling winds and relentless rain battering the city's skyline. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, Daniel Hayes stood motionless, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the chaos outside. The city lights blurred through the rain, but Daniel wasn't looking at the bustling streets below. He wasn't thinking about the people rushing to escape the downpour or the cars honking in frustration. No, his mind was far from the present. In his hand, he held a photograph, creased and worn from years of handling. It was a picture of his father, Robert Hayes, standing proudly in front of the Hayes Realty headquarters. The man in the photo had been a titan of the real estate world, a visionary who had built an empire from nothing. But that empire had crumbled 7 years ago, leaving nothing but ashes and ruin. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared at the image. His father's downfall hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been bad luck or poor decisions. No, it had been sabotage. And Daniel knew exactly who was responsible: Caldwell Industries. The memory of that day was seared into his mind. The headlines had been merciless. Hayes Realty scandal, fraud allegations rocked the industry. His father had been accused of embezzlement, his reputation destroyed overnight. The company's stock plummeted, investors fled, and within weeks, Hayes Realty was no more. The stress and humiliation had been too much for Robert Hayes to bear. Daniel had found him in his study, slumped over his desk, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a suicide note in the other. The note had been short, almost clinical. "I failed. I'm sorry." Daniel's grip on the photograph tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had been just 25 at the time, fresh out of business school and ready to join his father's company. Instead, he had been left with nothing but grief and a burning desire for revenge. For years he had worked in silence, rebuilding his life piece by piece. He had started his own real estate firm, clawing his way back to the top of the industry. But his success wasn't enough. It would never be enough, not until he had taken back everything that had been stolen from him. On the desk behind him, a folder lay open, its contents neatly arranged. Inside were documents detailing his latest acquisition, a controlling stake in Caldwell Industries. The company that had once been his father's greatest rival was now on the brink of collapse, its debts mounting and its reputation in shambles. Daniel turned away from the window, his expression cold and unyielding. He had waited 7 years for this moment. 7 years to see the Caldwell name brought to its knees. And now, he was ready to strike. Across the city, in a dimly lit office, Elena Caldwell sat hunched over her desk, her head resting in her hands. The once pristine space was now cluttered with stacks of financial reports, folders filled with failed negotiations, and a half-empty cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Elena's chest tightened as she stared at the numbers on the latest report. The situation was worse than she had feared. Caldwell Industries, the company her father had spent his entire life building, was drowning in debt. The banks were circling like vultures, and the shareholders were growing restless. Her father, Richard Caldwell, had been a legend in the business world. He had started the company with nothing but a dream and a relentless work ethic, turning it into one of the most respected names in the industry. But after his sudden death last year, everything had fallen apart. Elena had tried to step into his shoes, to lead the company with the same strength and determination he had shown. But the truth was, she wasn't her father. She didn't have his experience, his connections, or his unshakable confidence. And now, she was paying the price. The media had been relentless, branding Caldwell Industries a sinking ship. Investors were pulling out, employees were jumping ship, and the board of directors was losing faith in her leadership. Elena closed her eyes, her mind racing. She had tried everything, negotiating with the banks, seeking new investors, even considering selling off some of the company's assets. But nothing had worked. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see her assistant, Claire, standing hesitantly in the doorway. "Helena," Claire said softly. "The board meeting is in an hour." Elena nodded, forcing herself to stand. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not when everything was on the line. As she straightened her blazer and prepared to face the board, a single thought echoed in her mind. "I won't let my father's legacy die." But deep down, she knew she couldn't save Caldwell Industries alone. She needed help. She needed a miracle. And she had no idea that her miracle was about to come in the form of Daniel Hayes, the man who had sworn to destroy her. The boardroom of Caldwell Industries was a battlefield. Elena Caldwell sat at the head of the long, polished table, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Around her, the board members, most of them older men with decades of experience, were growing restless. Their voices overlapped, rising in frustration as they hurled questions and accusations at her. "This is unacceptable, Elena," one of the senior members snapped, his face red with anger. "The company's stock has dropped another 15% this quarter. Do you have any idea what that means for our investors?" Another man chimed in, his tone sharp and condescending. "We've been patient, but it's clear you don't have a real plan. If we don't act now, Caldwell Industries will be finished within months." Elena's chest tightened, but she refused to let her emotions show. She had spent the past year fighting to keep the company afloat, but the pressure was relentless. The board wanted answers, solutions, miracles, and she had none to give. "I've been in talks with the banks," Elena said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "If we can demonstrate recovery potential, they may consider extending our loans." "Recovery potential," one of the men scoffed. "Who do you think you're fooling? No one trusts a dying company, Elena. The banks won't save us, and neither will empty promises." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their collective frustration pressing down on her. Elena took a deep breath, her mind racing for a way to regain control. But before she could speak, the door to the boardroom swung open. The sound of footsteps echoed through the room as a tall, imposing figure entered. Daniel Hayes. Elena's heart stopped. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. His sharp gray eyes scanned the table, lingering on Elena for just a moment before he stepped forward. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice smooth and confident. "And Miss Caldwell?" Elena's stomach churned. She hadn't seen Daniel Hayes in years, but she knew exactly who he was. The name Hayes was practically a curse in her family, a reminder of the bitter rivalry between their fathers. "What is the meaning of this?" one of the board members demanded, his tone laced with irritation. Daniel smiled faintly, his expression calm but calculating. "I'm here because I now hold the majority stake in Caldwell Industries." The room erupted into chaos. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. "Majority stake? How? When?" "It's impossible," one of the men shouted. "You can't just—" "I assure you, it's very possible," Daniel interrupted, his tone cool and unbothered. "Over the past few months, I've been quietly acquiring shares, and as of this morning, I own 51% of Caldwell Industries." Elena's hands clenched into fists under the table. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, but she refused to look at him. "This is outrageous," another board member muttered. "What are your intentions, Mr. Hayes?" Daniel's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "My intentions are simple. I'm here to save this company." The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Elena finally found her voice. "Save it?" she said, her tone sharp. "Why would you care about saving Caldwell Industries?" Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Because I'm a businessman, Miss Caldwell, and I see potential where others see failure." She narrowed her eyes, suspicion creeping into her voice. "And what's the catch?" Daniel's smile didn't falter. He stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "The catch," he said slowly, "is you." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. "What are you talking about?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough for only her to hear. "I'll pay off all of Caldwell Industries' debts. I'll stabilize the company and restore its reputation. But in return, you'll marry me." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Elena froze, her mind reeling. Marry him? This had to be some kind of sick joke. "You're insane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel straightened, his expression calm and unyielding. "I'm very serious. Marry me for 1 year, and I'll save your company. Refuse, and Caldwell Industries will collapse. The choice is yours." Elena's hands trembled as she stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to tell him to go to hell, but she couldn't. She couldn't let her father's legacy die. The board members were watching her, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. They didn't know what Daniel had just said, but they could sense the tension in the room. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Daniel's gaze. "You're asking me to sell myself to save this company." Daniel's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "I'm asking you to make a business decision, nothing more." Her chest tightened as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She hated him. She hated everything he stood for, but she couldn't let her father's life's work crumble. With a trembling hand, she picked up the pen in front of her and signed the preliminary agreement. Daniel's smile returned, cold and triumphant. "Congratulations, Miss Caldwell. Or should I say, Mrs. Hayes?" Elena glared at him, her voice like a blade. "Don't celebrate too soon, Hayes. This isn't over." Daniel chuckled, amusement flashing in his eyes. "Oh, I know. This is just the beginning." The sprawling lakefront estate was breathtaking, a masterpiece of modern architecture with its sleek glass walls and sharp, angular design. It stood like a fortress on the edge of Lake Michigan, its reflection shimmering in the water below. But to Elena Caldwell, it felt more like a prison. She stood in the grand foyer, her suitcase at her feet, staring up at the massive chandelier that hung from the ceiling. The house was cold, not in temperature but in atmosphere. Everything about it screamed wealth and power, but there was no warmth, no soul. "This will be your home for the next year," Daniel Hayes said, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression he always wore. Elena turned to him, her jaw tight. "It doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a museum." Daniel's lips twitched, almost as if he were amused. "You'll get used to it." She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up her suitcase and followed the butler, who had appeared to escort her to her room. The room was as grand as the rest of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the lake. The bed was massive, draped in crisp white linens, and the furniture was sleek and modern. But Elena barely noticed any of it. She dropped her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. How had her life come to this? A year ago, she had been the confident CEO of Caldwell Industries, determined to carry on her father's legacy. Now, she was trapped in a marriage of convenience, with a man who despised her. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Claire, her assistant. "The board is relieved. They think Daniel Hayes is the company's savior. Are you okay?" Elena stared at the screen for a moment, before typing a quick reply. "I'll survive." But as she set the phone down, she wasn't sure she believed her own words. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unspoken rules. Daniel had made it clear from the start, this was a business arrangement, nothing more. They would maintain separate rooms, attend public events together when necessary, and keep up appearances for the sake of the company. But beyond that, they were to stay out of each other's way. Elena was more than happy to comply. She had no desire to spend any more time with Daniel than absolutely necessary, but avoiding him wasn't as easy as she had hoped. Every morning, she would find him in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. He barely acknowledged her presence, but she could feel his eyes on her as she poured herself a cup of tea. Every evening, they would sit across from each other at the long dining table, the silence between them almost deafening. The staff would serve their meals, and they would eat in near total silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. It was unbearable. But Elena wasn't one to back down from a challenge. If Daniel thought he could intimidate her into submission, he was sorely mistaken. She refused to let him see how much this situation was affecting her. Instead, she focused on her work, spending hours in the study reviewing company reports and strategizing ways to rebuild Caldwell Industries. One evening, as she sat at the desk surrounded by stacks of papers, Daniel walked in. "You're working late," he said, his tone neutral. Elena didn't look up. Some of us don't have the luxury of delegating everything to assistants. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he walked over to the bar in the corner of the room and poured himself a glass of whiskey. "You know," he said, leaning against the bar, "you don't have to do this alone. I'm here to help." Elena finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "Help? Is that what you call this? Forcing me into a marriage and taking over my company?" Daniel's expression hardened. "I didn't force you to do anything. You made a choice." "A choice?" Elena stood, her voice rising. "You gave me no choice, Daniel. You backed me into a corner and left me with no way out." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Then Daniel set his glass down and walked toward her, his gaze intense. "You think I enjoy this?" he said, his voice low. "You think I wanted this?" Elena's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to back down. "I don't know what you want, Daniel, and honestly, I don't care." He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Despite their constant clashes, there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when the walls between them seemed to crack. One night, Elena found herself in the library, unable to sleep. She was curled up in an armchair, a book in her lap, when Daniel walked in. "I didn't know you liked to read," he said, his tone softer than usual. Elena glanced up, surprised. "There's a lot you don't know about me." Daniel hesitated for a moment before sitting in the chair across from her. For the first time, they talked not about the company, not about their arrangement, but about books, childhood memories, and the things they had lost. It was a small moment, but it stayed with Elena long after Daniel had left the room. As the weeks went on, Elena began to see glimpses of a different side of Daniel. He wasn't just the cold, calculating businessman she had thought he was. There was something else beneath the surface, something he was trying desperately to hide. But she couldn't let herself care. She couldn't let herself forget why she was here. This wasn't a real marriage. It was a transaction, a means to an end. And yet, as she lay awake in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to change. Elena sat in the quiet of the study, the soft glow of the desk lamp illuminating the papers spread out before her. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the wind outside. It was late, well past midnight, but she couldn't sleep, not when her mind was racing with questions she couldn't answer. For weeks now, she had been trying to piece together the truth. Something about Daniel's vendetta didn't add up. He was so certain that her father, Richard Caldwell, had been responsible for the downfall of Hayes Realty. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little sense it made. Her father had been a ruthless businessman, yes, but he had always played by the rules. He had built Caldwell Industries from the ground up, earning respect even from his competitors. Sabotaging Hayes Realty would have been beneath him. Elena's fingers hovered over a stack of old financial reports she had pulled from the company archives. She had spent hours combing through them, looking for anything that might explain what had happened 7 years ago, and now she was starting to see a pattern, one that pointed to someone else entirely. Across the hall, Daniel was in his own room, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had eluded him for weeks, ever since Elena had moved into the house. He hated how much she occupied his thoughts. He hated the way her defiance challenged him, the way her presence unsettled him, but most of all, he hated the way she made him question everything he thought he knew. For years, he had clung to his hatred for the Caldwell family. It had been his fuel, his purpose. But now, as he watched Elena fight to save her father's company, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been wrong. The memory of his father's death was still fresh in his mind even after all these years. The scandal, the humiliation, the way the media had torn their family apart, it had all led back to Caldwell Industries. Or so he had believed. But what if he had been wrong? Daniel shook his head, trying to push the thought away. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now, not when he was so close to getting everything he had worked for. The next morning, Elena decided to take her investigation a step further. She had found a name buried in the financial reports, a name that kept appearing in connection with both Caldwell Industries and Hayes Realty: Adam Reed. Adam Reed was a private financier, a man who operated in the shadows of the business world. He was known for his ability to manipulate markets, orchestrate hostile takeovers, and profit from the chaos he created. Elena had never met him, but she had heard enough to know that he was dangerous. And now she was starting to suspect that he had been the one pulling the strings all along. She spent the day making calls, reaching out to old contacts, and digging through public records. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that Adam Reed had orchestrated the downfall of both Hayes Realty and Caldwell Industries. But she needed proof. That evening, as Elena sat in the study, Daniel walked in. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone sharp. Elena looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him come in. "Working," she said, quickly closing the file in front of her. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "On what?" "Company business," she replied, her voice steady. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her. "Don't lie to me, Elena. I know you've been digging into the past." Elena's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "And what if I have? Don't you want to know the truth?" "I already know the truth," Daniel said, his voice cold. "Your father destroyed my family. End of story." "No," Elena said, standing to face him. "That's not the end of the story, Daniel. There's more to this than you realize." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Don't try to rewrite history, Elena. I know what happened." "Do you?" she shot back, her voice rising. "Or have you just been telling yourself the same story for so long that you can't see the truth anymore?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was electric, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Daniel turned away, his hands clenched into fists. "Stay out of it, Elena. This isn't your fight." "It is my fight," she said, her voice firm. "Because if you're wrong, then you've spent the last 7 years hating the wrong person." Daniel didn't respond. He walked out of the room, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. The next day, Elena decided to confront Adam Reed directly. She had managed to track him down to a private club in the city, a place where the wealthy and powerful conducted their business away from prying eyes. Dressed in a sleek black suit, Elena walked into the club with her head held high. She spotted Adam sitting in a corner booth, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a smug smile on his face. "Miss Caldwell," he said as she approached. "What a surprise." Elena didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I know what you did," she said, her voice steady. Adam raised an eyebrow, his smile never faltering. "You'll have to be more specific." "You orchestrated the downfall of Hayes Realty," she said, "and now you're trying to do the same to Caldwell Industries." Adam chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "You're a smart woman, Elena, but you're in over your head." "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her eyes blazing. "You should be," Adam replied, his tone dark, "because if you keep digging, you won't like what you find." Elena's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. "I'm not stopping until the truth comes out." Adam leaned back in his chair, his smile fading. "Then you'd better be prepared for the consequences." As Elena left the club, her mind was racing. She had gotten under Adam's skin, but she knew she was playing a dangerous game. And she had no idea just how dangerous it was about to become. The tension in the house was palpable. Days had passed since Elena's confrontation with Adam Reed, but the weight of their conversation lingered in her mind. She had uncovered enough to know that Adam was the true mastermind behind the destruction of both Hayes Realty and Caldwell Industries. But she still lacked the concrete evidence to expose him. Worse, she knew she was being watched. Elena had noticed subtle changes, her phone calls being interrupted, emails mysteriously disappearing, and even the feeling of being followed when she left the estate. Adam Reed wasn't just dangerous, he was ruthless. And now she was in his crosshairs. But she couldn't stop, not now. Meanwhile, Daniel Hayes was beginning to notice a change in Elena. He had always seen her as stubborn and defiant, but now there was something else, an edge of fear she was trying desperately to hide. She was quieter at dinner, her sharp retorts replaced by distracted silence. She spent more time locked away in the study, and when she thought no one was watching, her expression betrayed the weight she was carrying. Daniel hated how much he noticed. He told himself it didn't matter. Whatever she was dealing with was her problem, not his. Their arrangement was purely transactional, and he had no obligation to care about her. But late one night, as he passed by the study, he saw her sitting at the desk, her head in her hands. Papers were scattered around her, and the faint glow of the desk lamp cast shadows across her face. Something about the sight stopped him in his tracks. For a moment he just stood there, watching her. She looked so small, so vulnerable, so unlike the fiery, determined woman he had come to know. Before he could stop himself, he stepped into the room. "Helena," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She looked up, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, gesturing to the papers in front of her. "It's late. You should be resting." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "Resting? That's a luxury I can't afford right now." Daniel frowned, stepping closer. "What's going on? You've been acting different." "Nothing's going on," she said quickly, but her voice wavered. "Elena," he said firmly, his gaze locking onto hers, "don't lie to me." For a moment she hesitated, her walls threatening to crumble, but then she shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Daniel. I can handle it." Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated how she always tried to shoulder everything on her own, as if letting someone in was a sign of weakness. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low. Elena's eyes softened for just a moment before she looked away. "I've been doing things alone my whole life. I'm used to it." Danielle wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't have to be so damn stubborn, but instead he just nodded. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Elena didn't respond, and after a moment, Daniel turned and left the room. But as he walked back to his own room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, Daniel found himself lingering in the kitchen, waiting for Elena to come down for breakfast. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down, He knew it was more than that. When she finally appeared, she looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her usual confident stride was replaced by something slower, more hesitant. "You look terrible," Daniel said, his tone blunt, but not unkind. "Thanks," Elena muttered, pouring herself a cup of tea. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching her. "You're not eating." "I'm not hungry," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Aliana," he said, his voice firm, "you need to take care of yourself." She finally looked up, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Why do you care, Daniel? This isn't a real marriage, remember? You don't have to pretend to be concerned about me." Daniel's expression darkened. "I'm not pretending." For a moment they just stared at each other, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. Then Alina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I'm fine, Daniel, really. You don't need to worry about me." But Daniel didn't believe her. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence was heavier than usual. Daniel watched as Elena pushed her food around her plate, barely taking a bite. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know how. Finally, he broke the silence. "You're not fine, Elena." She looked up, startled. "What?" "You're not fine," he repeated. "I don't know what's going on, but I can see it. You're scared." Elena's fork clattered against her plate as she set it down. "I'm not scared," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You can lie to everyone else, but you can't lie to me. Something's wrong, and I want to know what it is." Elena hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to share the burden she was carrying, but she couldn't. "It's nothing," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's jaw tightened, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Fine, keep your secrets, but whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." Elena looked at him, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, but then she remembered Adam Reed's warning, the consequences of digging too deep. "I'll be fine," she said, forcing a smile. "I always am." But as she walked away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying not just to him, but to herself. That night, as Daniel lay in bed, he found himself thinking about Elena. He hated how much he cared, how much he wanted to protect her. This wasn't supposed to happen. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop himself. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at the email on her laptop screen. It was from an anonymous sender, but the message was clear. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Her heart pounded in her chest as she reread the words. She had known Adam Reed wouldn't take her investigation lightly, but this was the first time he had made a direct threat. The weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. She was in over her head, and she knew it. But she couldn't stop now. Elena had spent the past few days piecing together the final threads of the puzzle. She had uncovered enough to prove that Adam Reed had orchestrated the collapse of Hayes Realty and was now targeting Caldwell Industries. He had manipulated the markets, planted false evidence, and used his influence to pit the two families against each other. But she still needed hard evidence, something undeniable that would expose him for the fraud he was. And she knew exactly where to find it. That evening, as Daniel returned home from a late meeting, he found Elena pacing in the study. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Elena stopped mid-step, her eyes darting to him. For a moment, she considered brushing him off, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. Daniel raised an eyebrow, surprised. "My help? With what?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Adam Reed. He's the one who destroyed your family's company, and he's trying to do the same to mine." Daniel's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "What are you talking about?" "I've been investigating," Elena said, stepping closer to him. I found evidence that Adam Reed manipulated the markets and planted false information to bring down Hayes Realty. He wanted to eliminate the competition, and now he's targeting Caldwell Industries. Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. For years, he had blamed the Caldwell family for his father's downfall. But now, hearing Elena's words, he felt the foundation of his hatred begin to crack. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, his voice low. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you," Elena admitted. "But now, I don't have a choice. I need your help to stop him." Daniel's eyes softened, and for the first time he saw the vulnerability in her. She wasn't just fighting for her company, she was fighting for her father's legacy, just as he had been fighting for his. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly, relief washing over her. "Adam keeps all his records in a private office downtown. If we can get in, we can find the proof we need to expose him." Daniel frowned. "You're talking about breaking into his office?" "Do you have a better idea?" Elena shot back. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is dangerous, Elena. If he catches you—" "I know the risks," she said firmly. "But I can't let him get away with this. Not again." Daniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. But if you're doing this, you're not doing it alone." The next night, Elena and Daniel found themselves standing outside Adam Reed's office building. It was a sleek, modern structure in the heart of the city, its glass facade reflecting the lights of the surrounding skyscrapers. Elena's heart raced as she glanced at Daniel. "Are you sure about this?" He smirked, his confidence unshaken. "You're the one who dragged me into this, remember?" She rolled her eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Despite everything, she was glad he was here. Using a keycard she had managed to acquire through one of her contacts, Elena swiped them into the building. The lobby was empty. The only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning. "His office is on the 15th floor, she whispered as they stepped into the elevator. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "Let's get this over with." The office was dark and eerily quiet as they entered. Elena's hands shook slightly as she turned on a small flashlight, illuminating the rows of filing cabinets and shelves. "Start looking for anything with his name on it," she whispered. Daniel nodded, moving to the other side of the room. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as they searched through the files. Elena's heart pounded with every passing second, the fear of being caught gnawing at her. Finally, she found it, a folder labeled Hayes Realty Acquisition Strategy. Her breath caught as she flipped through the pages. It was all there. Emails, financial records, and even a signed contract outlining Adam's plan to dismantle Hayes Realty and absorb its assets. "Daniel," she whispered, holding up the folder. "I found it." He crossed the room quickly, his eyes scanning the documents. His jaw tightened as he read, the truth hitting him like a punch to the gut. "These years," he muttered, his voice filled with anger and regret. "I blamed your family for this." Elena placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle. "You didn't know, but now we can make this right." Before Daniel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Elena's blood ran cold. "Someone's coming." Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back of the office. "We need to get out of here, now." They slipped out through a side door just as the main office door opened. Elena's heart raced as they hurried down the emergency stairwell, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. When they finally reached the street, Elena let out a shaky breath. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and adrenaline. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't over yet. Adam won't go down without a fight." Elena met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. "Then we'll fight. Together." For the first time, Daniel felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next morning, Elena and Daniel sat in the study, the folder of incriminating evidence spread out on the desk between them. The weight of what they had uncovered hung heavy in the air. "This is enough to destroy him," Daniel said, his voice low but resolute. Elena nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the documents. It's not just about destroying him. It's about clearing our family's names. My father, your father. They didn't deserve what happened to them. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. Adam Reed has been playing us for fools for years. He turned us against each other so we wouldn't see the real enemy. Elena looked at him, her expression softening. And we let him. We let our anger and pride blind us to the truth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was filled with unspoken regret, but also a newfound understanding. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. What's the plan? Elena straightened, her determination returning. We take this to the authorities. The SEC, the media, anyone who can hold him accountable. But we have to be smart about it. Adam has connections everywhere. If he gets wind of this before we act, he'll bury us. Daniel nodded. Agreed, we'll need to move fast. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Elena and Daniel worked together, reaching out to trusted contacts and carefully building their case. They compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. For the first time, they were truly working as a team. Daniel was surprised by how well they complemented each other. Elena's sharp intellect and resourcefulness were matched by his strategic thinking and ability to navigate the corporate world. Together, they were unstoppable. But as they worked late into the night, Daniel found himself noticing more than just Elena's determination. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she found a crucial piece of evidence, the way her lips curved into a small smile when she was deep in thought. He hated to admit it, but he was beginning to feel something he hadn't expected, admiration, and maybe even something more. On the third day, they received a call from one of Elena's contacts at the SEC. "This is solid," the man said, his voice crackling through the speakerphone. "If what you're saying checks out, Adam Reed is looking at serious charges, fraud, market manipulation, conspiracy. But you need to be careful. A man like him won't go down without a fight." Elena glanced at Daniel, her expression grim. "We understand. Just tell us what we need to do." The contact outlined the next steps, and by the time the call ended, they had a clear plan. "We're almost there," Elena said, leaning back in her chair. Daniel nodded, but his expression was serious. "Almost isn't good enough. Until Adam is behind bars, we can't let our guard down." Elena met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "We won't." That evening, as they prepared to submit the evidence, Daniel received a call from an unknown number. "Yes," he answered, his tone cautious. "Daniel." A familiar voice drawled on the other end. It was Adam Reed. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" Adam chuckled, the sound cold and menacing. "I hear you've been busy, digging into things that don't concern you." Daniel's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "You're finished, Adam. We have everything we need to expose you." "Do you?" Adam's tone was mocking. "You think a few pieces of paper are enough to take me down? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Daniel's jaw clenched. "We'll see about that." Adam's voice turned icy. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. Walk away now, and I might let you and Elena live to see another day." Daniel's blood ran cold, but he refused to let Adam see his fear. "You don't scare me." "We'll see," Adam said before the line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone, his mind racing. "What is it?" Elena asked, noticing the tension in his expression. "Harder," Daniel said, his voice grim. "He knows." Elena's eyes widened. "How?" "You remembered." "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "But he just threatened us." Elena's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Then we need to act now. We can't give him any more time to cover his tracks." Daniel nodded. "Agreed. Let's finish this." The next morning, Elena and Daniel submitted the evidence to the SEC and a trusted journalist at a major news outlet. Within hours, the story broke. Headlines across the country exposed Adam Reed's crimes, detailing his years of fraud and manipulation. The SEC announced an official investigation, and warrants were issued for Adam's arrest. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, as Elena and Daniel celebrated their success, a black SUV pulled up outside the estate. Daniel's instincts kicked in immediately. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a nearby fireplace poker as he moved toward the door. "Daniel, wait," Elena started, but he was already gone. As he opened the door, two men in suits stepped out of the SUV. "Mr. Hayes," one of them said, his tone calm but menacing. "We need to have a word." Daniel's grip on the poker tightened. "If Adam sent you, you can tell him it's over." The man smirked. "I'm afraid it's not that simple." Before Daniel could react, the second man lunged at him. Inside, Elena heard the commotion and ran to the door. "Daniel!" she screamed as she saw him struggling with the two men. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy vase from the entryway table and smashed it over one of the men's heads. The man stumbled, giving Daniel the opening he needed to fight off the other. "Get inside!" Daniel shouted, pulling Elena back into the house and slamming the door shut. They locked it and backed away, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was that?" Elena asked, her voice shaking. "Adam's last-ditch effort," Daniel said, his eyes blazing with anger. "But it won't work. Not this time." Elena nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "We're not backing down." Daniel looked at her, his expression softening. "No, we're not." For the first time, he realized just how much he admired her strength and just how much he cared about her. The attack on the estate had shaken both Elena and Daniel, but it had also solidified their resolve. Adam Reed was desperate, and desperate men made mistakes. They knew they had to stay one step ahead of him if they wanted to see this through. The next morning, Daniel made a call to an old friend, Marcus Kane, a former private investigator who had helped him in the past. "Marcus, I need your help," Daniel said, his tone urgent. "Hayes, it's been a while," Marcus replied. "What's going on?" Daniel quickly explained the situation, detailing Adam Reed's crimes and the recent attack. Marcus let out a low whistle. "You've got yourself in deep, my friend. But if Reed's as cornered as you say, he's bound to slip up. I'll dig into his recent movements and see what I can find." "Thanks, Marcus," Daniel said. "We're running out of time." "Don't worry," Marcus replied. "If there's a way to bring him down, I'll find it." Meanwhile, Elena was working on her own plan. She had reached out to the journalist who had broken the story, providing additional details and ensuring the media pressure on Adam Reed didn't let up. The more public scrutiny he faced, the harder it would be for him to retaliate. But she knew it wasn't enough. Adam was still out there, and as long as he was free, they weren't safe. That evening, as she sat in the study, Daniel walked in, his expression grim. "Marcus found something," he said, closing the door behind him. Elena looked up, her heart racing. "What is it?" "Adam's been moving money into offshore accounts," Daniel explained. "He's preparing to flee the country." Elena's eyes narrowed. "We can't let that happen." "We won't," Daniel said. "Marcus also found out where he's hiding. He's holed up in a private estate outside the city." Elena stood, her determination unwavering. "Then we go to him." Daniel frowned. "Elena, this isn't a game. Adam's dangerous. If we confront him, there's no guarantee we'll walk away unscathed." "I know the risks," Elena said, meeting his gaze. "But we can't let him escape. Not after everything he's done." Daniel hesitated, torn between his instincts to protect her and his own desire for justice. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we do this together." The next night, under the cover of darkness, Elena and Daniel drove to Adam Reed's estate. The property was heavily guarded, with security cameras and patrols circling the perimeter. But Marcus had provided them with a detailed layout of the estate, including a blind spot in the security system. As they approached the fence, Daniel turned to Elena. "Are you sure about this?" Elena nodded, her expression resolute. "I've never been more sure of anything." With that, they slipped through the blind spot and made their way toward the main house. Inside the estate, Adam Reed was pacing in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He had underestimated Elena and Daniel, and now his empire was crumbling around him. The media was relentless, the SEC was closing in, and his once loyal allies were abandoning him. But he wasn't going down without a fight. As he stared out the window, he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. His lips curled into a sneer. "Ooh, they've come to me," he muttered, setting down his glass. He pressed a button on his desk, summoning his security team. Elena and Daniel had just reached the back entrance when they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. "Someone's coming," Daniel whispered, pulling Elena behind a column. They watched as 2 guards passed by, their flashlights sweeping the area. Once the guards were out of sight, Daniel turned to Elena. "We need to move fast. If they catch us, we're done." Elena nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's go." They slipped into the house, navigating the dimly lit hallways toward Adam's study. When they reached the door, Daniel motioned for Elena to stay back. He pushed the door open, stepping inside with a confidence that belied the tension in his body. Adam was waiting for them, seated behind his desk with a smug expression. "Well, well," Adam said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it isn't the dynamic duo. I was wondering when you'd show up." "Cut the act, Adam," Daniel said, his voice cold. "It's over." Adam chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're up against." Elena stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "We have everything we need to take you down. The SEC, the media, they're all coming for you." Adam's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You're playing a dangerous game, Elena. Do you really think you can outsmart me?" "We already have," she shot back. Adam's expression darkened. "You're making a mistake. Walk away now, and I might let you live." Daniel stepped closer, his fists clenched. "We're not afraid of you, Adam. You've already lost." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Adam reached for something under his desk. "Watch out!" Elena shouted, lunging forward. Daniel reacted instantly, grabbing Adam's arm and slamming it against the desk. A gun clattered to the floor, and Adam let out a cry of pain. "You're done, Reed," Daniel growled, pinning him in place. Elena quickly grabbed the gun and pointed it at Adam, her hands steady. "It's over." Adam glared at them, his confidence finally crumbling. "You think this changes anything? I have connections. I'll be out in no time." "Not this time," Elena said, her voice firm. "The world knows who you are now. There's no escaping this." Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. Elena and Daniel had called Marcus, who had tipped off the authorities. As the police stormed the estate, Adam was handcuffed and led away, his protests falling on deaf ears. Elena and Daniel stood outside, watching as the man who had caused them so much pain was finally brought to justice. "It's over," Elena said softly, her voice filled with relief. Daniel looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it." Elena turned to him, her eyes shining. "We did it together." For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of peace. The hatred that had consumed him was gone, replaced by something he hadn't expected: hope, and maybe even love. The weeks following Adam Reed's arrest were a whirlwind. The media frenzy surrounding his crimes only grew as more details emerged. The SEC's investigation uncovered years of fraud, manipulation, and corruption, and Adam's once powerful empire crumbled overnight. For Elena and Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. They had cleared their families' names and brought justice to the man who had torn their lives apart, but the journey had left its mark on both of them. One crisp morning, Elena stood on the balcony of the Caldwell estate, gazing out at the sprawling gardens below. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. The company was recovering, slowly but surely. With Adam out of the picture, investors were returning and the board had rallied behind her leadership. Caldwell Industries was no longer on the brink of collapse. It was thriving. But it wasn't just the company that had changed. "Elena," a familiar voice called from behind her. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. The weight of his anger and grief finally lifted. "Good morning," she said, smiling. He walked over, handing her the coffee. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, taking a sip. "Too much on my mind." Daniel leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on her. "Good things, I hope?" She nodded, her smile softening. "Mostly. It's strange, though. For so long I was consumed by saving the company, by proving myself. Now that it's finally happening, I don't know what to do next." Daniel chuckled. "You could take a vacation. God knows you've earned it." Elena laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Maybe. What about you? What's next for Daniel Hayes?" He hesitated, his expression turning thoughtful. "For years, I thought my only purpose was to rebuild what my family lost. But now, I think it's time to start over, to build something new." Elena looked at him, her heart swelling with admiration. "You've changed, Daniel." "So have you," he said, his voice soft. For a moment they stood in silence, the unspoken connection between them growing stronger. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You know, when this all started, I never thought we'd end up here." "Neither did I," Elena admitted. "But I'm glad we did." He reached out, taking her hand in his. "Me too." A few weeks later, Elena and Daniel stood together at a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as they stepped up to the podium. Elena took a deep breath, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, but then she felt Daniel's hand on her back, steadying her. "You've got this," he whispered. She nodded, her confidence returning. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Today marks a new chapter for both Caldwell Industries and Hayes Realty. For years, our families were pitted against each other, victims of lies and manipulation. But now, we're united in a common goal: to rebuild, to grow, and to create a better future." The room erupted in applause, and as Elena stepped back from the podium, Daniel took her place. "I'd like to echo Elena's words," he said, his tone firm but warm. "This isn't just about business. It's about redemption, about proving that even in the face of betrayal and loss, we can rise above. Together we're stronger than ever." As the applause grew louder, Elena and Daniel exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. This was their moment, a chance to leave the past behind and embrace the future. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Elena and Daniel found themselves back at the Caldwell estate. They sat on the balcony, a bottle of wine between them, the weight of the day finally lifting. "To new beginnings," Daniel said, raising his glass. Elena smiled, clinking her glass against his. "To new beginnings." As they sipped their wine, the conversation turned to lighter topics: travel plans, favorite books, and childhood memories. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to simply enjoy the moment. But, as the night wore on, the conversation grew quieter, the space between them shrinking. "Elena," Daniel said softly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Yes," she replied, her heart skipping a beat. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad we were forced into this mess. If it hadn't happened, I never would have met the real you." Her breath caught, her cheeks flushing. "And I never would have seen the real you." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're incredible, Elena. Strong, brilliant, fearless. I don't know how I didn't see it before." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe we were too busy hating each other." Daniel chuckled. "Maybe, but I don't hate you anymore." "Good," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I don't hate you either." And with that, he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate. In that moment, all the pain, anger, and betrayal of the past melted away, leaving only the promise of a brighter future. Months later, Elena and Daniel stood together at the groundbreaking ceremony for a new joint venture between Caldwell Industries and Hayes Realty. As they watched the first shovel break ground, Elena slipped her hand into Daniel's, a smile playing on her lips. "This is just the beginning," she said. Daniel squeezed her hand, his own smile widening. "And I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." Together they had faced the worst and come out stronger. Now they were ready to build something new, not just in business, but in life.